Thank you, Dr. Mahan. Again, this will be very informal. I'm sure the panelists will be happy to engage in discussion. We have formal discussion slated, but I'm sure if you have a burning question, you can be calling as well. Antulio Echevarria will get us started here. Many of you from the Army know his great work. He's written extensively about Clausewitz. He's probably one of the Army's leading scholars about war, and Clausewitz especially. So, Tony, please kick us off.
Thank you very much. Very honored to be here, especially amongst this esteemed panel. And I have to say, I can't remember ever having witnessed this sort of thing happening inside the Pentagon in my tours or since then. So this is really unique. Let me start off by making a couple of comments about the relevance of Clausewitz, since that is sort of the overall theme, I think, for today, and particularly for practitioners, since I was one, and since we have so many in the audience here. So why should we study a theory and a theorist that is more than 180 years old? Well, the usual answer is because Clausewitz helps us understand or think about war instead of it's the how as opposed to the what. In other words, gives us a way or how to think about war without providing a prescriptive doctrine or what. But I think that answer only goes so far, particularly because there has to be, at the end of that answer, there has to be a what worth going through 600 pages for. There has to be some propositions within it that are defensible and that have perhaps stood the test of time. So fortunately for us, On War does both of those things. It provides a how for us. It also provides a what. So how should practitioners try to engage that what, those sets of propositions that are within On War? Obviously, we don't want to approach it the way we might for a military manual or a how-to guide, but how do we engage those propositions? One approach, of course, is just keep reading On War again and again until what he's trying to say actually comes forth and we grasp it. We have seminars and we discuss these things. Those are worthy approaches, of course. But I think what we really need to do is to engage the propositions, analyze and test them in ways that are not advocating or trying to prove or validate propositions, but to test them against the history of warfare, and which in the process will help us understand both the propositions better and the history of war better. So we'll come out in a positive light at the end of that process. So the analyze and test propositions, how do we go about doing it? What kinds of examples might we have to try to increase our understanding through analysis and testing as opposed to advocating? Well, one of the propositions that readily comes to mind is the center of gravity, which is an example of how not to go about testing, analyzing Clausewitz's propositions, because we've gone from analyzing the center of gravity and what he may or may not have meant by it to advocating it, to a military doctrine that says we absolutely have to find a center of gravity before we begin our campaign planning and before we begin developing military strategies around the conditions and what we want to achieve and the enemy and so forth. So that's a negative example where we've gone too far, I think. Another proposition, defense versus attack, defense being stronger than attack. Many of you probably agree with that proposition because you are familiar with Clausewitz and you know that's one of the arguments within On War. Many others will not agree with it. What we can do with those propositions, once we test them against the history of warfare, we can then draw deductions and other observations, further observations from that. For instance, if the defense is in fact stronger than the attack, that means that the nature of war is by its very nature asymmetrical. There's never an equal balance between attack and defense, never an equal balance between one side or the other. never symmetry really present. So that labels like asymmetry, asymmetric war, then become superfluous or redundant, and they should smack to us as amateurism or something perhaps worse than that. So when we test these propositions against the history of war, and if we find they are in fact defensible, find that there are indeed many cases in which these propositions do hold up, we should take the next step and draw some deductions, some observations from those, which would educate ourselves in terms of what war and warfare are, and hopefully also inform the military profession, educate the military profession. For instance, I don't think we are taking our contemporary theories of war and balancing against the Trinity, for instance. We have, today in the U.S. military, we have land power theories, we have air power theories, we have sea power theories, and we have a joint community trying to pull these together into some sort of unified theory, and without success, I'm afraid to say. However, each of these theories is founded upon some assumptions that we ought to, as a profession, examine, tease out, and explore, determine whether these, in fact, are valid assumptions to be making. I think what we have is a series of how-to approaches, how to wage war in these theories without necessarily having a coherent contemporary theory of war, which I think needs to be written for the 21st century. I think that what we need to do is take it to the next level, if you will, and determine to what extent our land power, sea power, air power theories are indeed one-sided. The kinds of things that Clausewitz eschewed, as we all know. To what extent do they not account for the passion, if you will, of the populace? To what extent do they not? What extent have they ignored purpose in the direction of war and focused only on overcoming or taking down your opponent? To what extent do they ignore the realm of chance in the conduct of war itself? I think we'll find out that a lot of these theories violate many aspects of the Trinity, and that to our detriment as a military profession. So that, I think, is one way, in my view, the best way for us to bring to relevance something written almost 2 centuries ago now, and thought about almost 2 centuries ago, which has value for us today. So, on that note, I will.
Dr. Echevarria, thank you. Before I turn over to Chris Bassford, I would like maybe as we get to the discussion period, or as people want to extemporize in their comments here, put a couple things on the table that are interesting to me especially. You know, all the things that Clausewitz has found his way into kind of contemporary military rule. The center of gravity is something we still talk a lot about. When I was in the Army, it's the COG, or COGS, right? It's a very pronounceable acronym, as the Army loves to do. There's been a couple of articles in Small Wars Journal over the last few months. One talking about how center of gravity has entered joint doctrine, how it's now a term that we actually have to find, and arguing that it's a mishmash, or more like a hash of what Clausewitz intended. And there was another article, I think yesterday or the day before, where an officer was saying that we need to think of the center of gravity for ISIS as its ideology. Just a longer discussion. So I guess one of the things I'll be curious to talk about, and perhaps people can address their comments, is the center of gravity analysis really helpful to us? Because it's used as a tool a lot. And if one were to think about ISIS, you know, what's the proper way to go about thinking about what their center of gravity might be? So just to be discussed perhaps later.